People on the south side of Millhaven watched a widow do something that made no sense. It was the late summer of 1887, along the Sawback River in the hill country of eastern Montana, and the woman living in the old Deering cabin at the edge of town had spent 3 straight weeks digging a trench around her property. Not a shallow scratch in the dirt. A ditch, 4 feet deep in places, nearly 3 feet across, ringing the entire 2-acre lot like a moat around a castle. She dug it by hand, a spade, a mattock, a wheelbarrow she'd borrowed from the feed store, and never quite returned. She hauled the excavated earth up onto the inner rim, packing it into a low berm that stood about 18 inches above the surrounding grade. She lined portions of the channel with flat river stones she'd carried herself from the Sawback's western bank, 1 armload at a time. Every morning before the heat came up, she was out there with her sleeves rolled past the elbow and her boots caked grey with clay. Every evening she was still at it, a lantern propped on a fence post, the sound of her mattock ringing against rock long after the rest of Millhaven had gone dark. They stood at fence lines and watched. They talked about it in the Mercantile. They called the ditch by a name meant to belittle it, meant to belittle her, and most of them laughed. By spring of the following year, they would not be laughing. By spring of the following year, the Sawback River would settle the argument the only way the natural world has ever settled such arguments, permanently, with water. The question every person in Millhaven should have been asking wasn't why she was digging. The question was what she knew about water that the rest of them had forgotten, and whether, if you had been there that summer with a fence to lean on and an opinion ready, you would have been among the ones who laughed, or among the rare few who picked up a spade and asked if they could help. If you want to find out why this woman's strange ditch became the most important piece of engineering in Millhaven's history, stay with us. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing, because the story of what happened the following April is the kind of story that only makes sense once you understand everything that came before it, and we are going to tell you all of it. Her name was Nora Vance. She had come to Millhaven 3 years earlier with her husband Thomas and a wagon loaded with furniture and a sheepdog named Burr. Short for nothing, just the sound of it, 1 syllable, easy to call across a field. Burr was a grey and white animal with 1 brown ear and the calm, watchful temperament of a dog that had decided long ago the world was mostly manageable if you paid it close enough attention. Thomas Vance had died the previous October. Pneumonia, after a week of riding fence in cold rain. He was 41 years old. He had never seen the ditch his wife would dig in his memory, though in a way she dug it because of him, because of what his death had made clear about the vulnerabilities of a person living alone on the edge of a floodplain, with no one to help when the water came. Because the water had come before, not in the dramatic, catastrophic way it would come later, but it had come. The spring before Thomas died, snowmelt off the Bitterroot foothills had raised the Sawback by 11 feet in 4 days. The low end of Millhaven had flooded knee-deep. 3 root cellars were ruined. A family on Pulpit Road lost their smokehouse, their stored meat, and a good portion of the floor of their home to standing water. The Deering cabin, Nora's cabin now, sat at the low end of a natural drainage slope, the ground falling away gently from the tree line in the north toward the river in the south. When the Sawback rose, it spread. And where it spread, it found the lowest ground first. It found the Deering lot. That year, Thomas had been alive. They had sandbagged and shoveled and worked 2 days straight to keep the worst of it out, and they had largely succeeded, though the root cellar had taken on 8 inches before they got it under control. Then, Thomas was gone. And Nora was alone with Burr and a winter to get through and a spring after the winter and all the springs after that. She spent the winter thinking. It was Callum Price who coined the name. Callum ran the lumber yard on the north end of Main Street, and he was the sort of man whose opinions arrived loudly and without much invitation. He was not a cruel man. He was simply the variety of person who mistakes confidence for knowledge, and who had spent enough years being right about ordinary things that he had developed a dangerous habit of assuming he was right about everything. He came by the Deering property on a Tuesday morning in late July, walking the road to the mill, and he stopped at the fence and watched Nora for a while. She was working the far corner of the south channel, breaking through a shelf of hard-pan clay with the blunt end of her mattock, Burr lying in the shade of the fence post watching her work with his chin on his paws. Callum watched for a full 2 minutes. Then, he said what he said. He called it the widow's moat. He said it loud enough for the two men walking with him to hear, and they laughed, and by supper time the whole of Millhaven had heard the name. The Widow's Moat. It was meant to call up the image of a woman who had perhaps lost her reason along with her husband. A woman playing at castles in the dirt. The name caught because names like that always catch. They're designed to. They give a community something to point at, a way of agreeing with each other that they understand something better than the person doing the thing. Nora heard it the same evening from the woman at the dry goods store, who told her with a kind of apologetic hesitation, the way people share bad news they also find a little bit interesting. Nora thanked her, bought the flour and the lamp oil she'd come for, and walked home. She did not respond to Callum Price. She did not explain herself at the fence line or in the mercantile or anywhere else. She went back to her ditch the next morning at first light, and the morning after that, and she worked until it was done. Silence, in her experience, was the only answer that couldn't be argued with. There was a second man who came by the property, and his visit was different in character, if not in conclusion. Henry Marsh was Millhaven's most experienced builder, 40 years in construction, first in Ohio, then in Wyoming, then in Montana. He was 63 years old and he had built more structures in the hill country than anyone else alive in the county. And when Henry Marsh had an opinion about how water or earth or timber behaved, people listened. He was not a loud man. He was the kind of man whose authority came from being right, with some frequency, about things that actually mattered. He came to see Nora on a Wednesday afternoon, hat in hand, and he asked if he could speak with her plainly. And she said he could. He told her he admired the work. He told her the channel was cleanly cut and the berm was well packed, and the stone lining on the south side was exactly what you'd want in that kind of soil. He said all of that first, because he believed it, and because he was that kind of man. Then he told her his concern. He told her a ditch like that, without proper drainage outlets at the corners, could in a bad flood year collect water rather than redirect it. That if the sawback came up fast enough, the moat, he used the word without the mockery behind it, could fill from runoff coming off the north slope, and if that water had nowhere to go, she'd have turned her own property into a basin, a bowl that caught the flood instead of deflecting it. He told her this with care. He drew a rough diagram in the dirt with a stick, showing where he thought the pressure points were, where the water would pool if the channel backed up. He pointed to the northeast corner of the lot, which was the lowest point of the surrounding grade, and he said that was where any system like this would find its weakest argument. Nora listened to all of it. She asked him 2 questions about the soil type along the northeast side. He answered them. She thanked him. He walked home thinking he had probably dissuaded her. He hadn't. But he had changed one corner of her ditch, and that one corner, 7 months later, would be part of why the cabin stayed dry. What Henry Marsh didn't know, what no one in Millhaven knew, was where Nora Vance had learned to think about water the way she thought about it. Her father's name was Ezra Pelletier. He had grown up in the bayou country of Louisiana, the son of a Cajun drainage engineer, and he had spent his first 30 years working in low country, places where the water table sat 18 inches below the surface, and the difference between a useful piece of land and a ruined one was entirely a question of where you put your channels and how you shaped your ground. He had come north eventually, married a Minnesota woman, settled in Wisconsin, and raised 4 children on a 40-acre farmstead in a river valley that flooded every 3rd spring without exception. He had built a drainage system around that farmstead, by hand, over the course of 11 years, that kept the farmhouse dry through every flood, while the neighbors lost root cellars and smokehouse floors, and in one bad year, an entire kitchen addition. He used to say the same thing every spring when the river started climbing. He'd stand on the back porch with his coffee and watch the water come up, and he'd say it quietly, almost to himself, "Water does not fight. Water only finds." Nora had heard him say it 100 times. She hadn't fully understood it until she was grown and standing in her own flooded root cellar with Thomas beside her, bailing with buckets, watching the water come in through the low corner of the east wall, no matter how fast they cleared it. Water does not fight. Water only finds. What her father meant was this: water had no preference, no malice, no agenda. It simply moved to wherever it was lower. It found every gap, every low point, every place where the ground sloped in its direction by even a fraction of an inch. You could not argue with it. You could not stop it by building a wall directly in its path, because it would go around the wall, or under it, or wait until the wall failed. The only way to manage water was to give it a better place to go, to be more deliberate about its path than the water itself was, which was to say, very deliberate indeed. Her father had taught her to read the ground the way some people read a book, to look at a piece of land and see where the water was going to go before the water arrived, to understand that every lot had a story told in its contours, and that story was always, eventually, a story about water. Water does not fight. Water only finds. She had carried that with her from Wisconsin to Montana. Across 1,000 miles of ground she'd read the whole way like a long, slow sentence. By the 1st of August, the main channel was complete. 4 feet at its deepest point, 3 feet wide through most of the run, with the excavated earth packed into an interior berm that gave the inner edge of the property an additional 1.5 feet of elevation above the surrounding grade. The stone lining on the south and east sides was laid tight, flat stones fitted against each other without mortar, resting on a bed of gravel she'd hauled in 2 wheelbarrow loads at a time from a gravel bar downstream. By the middle of August, she had addressed the northeast corner. This was the change Henry Marsh had prompted with his diagram in the dirt, and she had spent the better part of a week thinking through how to do it before she understood the answer. The problem was what he'd said. If the channel filled faster than it could drain, it became a liability. The solution was an overflow point, a deliberate gap in the berm at the northeast corner, lower than the rest, that would allow water above a certain level to spill out and away from the property rather than building pressure against the cabin side of the channel. She cut that gap herself, to a precise height of 26 inches above the channel floor. She sloped the exit grade away from the property at a fall of about 3 inches per 10 feet, aimed toward the natural drainage swale that ran along the north side of the road. In a light flood, the ditch would collect and redirect surface water before it ever reached the cabin. In a heavy flood, if the channel filled, the overflow would escape through that corner gap and route itself down the road swale toward the river. She ran a mental test against her father's principle every evening. She stood at different points around the property and asked herself where the water would find. She asked herself what it would do if she was wrong about this, or wrong about that. She moved 2 stones and repacked 1 section of berm where she thought the clay had settled unevenly. She added 8 more feet of stone lining on the west side, in a section where the soil was sandier and more prone to erosion. By September, it was done. The ditch was 412 feet long, running the full perimeter of the 2-acre lot. It had taken her 61 days to complete it. Her hands had blisters on top of old blisters, the deep kind that callous over and stop hurting and become simply part of the hand. Her boots had worn through at the right toe. She had lost 11 pounds. Burr had watched the whole thing from various positions of shade around the property. He had developed an opinion about the northwest corner in particular, which was apparently the best place to observe the work. He lay there most evenings, head up, ears slightly forward, watching her pack the berm in the last of the light. The widow's moat, the town called it. Nora called it a drainage system. Her father had taught her the right name for the thing she'd built, and she used that name in the privacy of her own mind. Because the name was accurate, and accuracy mattered. The first failure came in late September, 3 weeks after she called the system finished. A hard rain, 3 inches in 6 hours, came in off the mountains on a Tuesday night, and the next morning Nora walked the perimeter and found a section of the south channel that had partially collapsed. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, a section about 14 feet long, where the channel wall had slumped inward, narrowing the ditch from 36 inches across to perhaps 22. The stones she'd laid along the base of that section had shifted, undermined from below, and the clay wall above them had followed. She stood there in the wet for a while, thinking. Then she got on her hands and knees in the mud and looked at the base of the collapsed section and understood what had happened. The gravel bed under those stones had been too shallow. She'd laid them on 2 inches of gravel. The water moving through the channel in that hard rain had worked its way under the stones and into the subsoil, and the subsoil had moved, and the stones had moved with it. She needed at least 4 inches of gravel bed. She needed the stones packed tighter, with smaller stones filling the gaps between the larger ones, so that moving water couldn't find its way through. She spent 4 days tearing out that section and doing it right. She hauled more gravel from the river bar. She reset the stones on a 4-inch bed, packed the gaps with gravel fines, and relaid the channel wall above with damper clay that she compacted in layers with the flat of a board. When she was done, she pressed her boot heel hard against the new wall in several places and felt it hold. Water does not fight. Water only finds. She had given it a place to find a weakness, and it had found it, and now she had closed it. That was the process. That had always been the process, the way her father worked, not assuming perfection on the first pass, but testing, failing in manageable ways, learning the specific failure, correcting it with precision. The system that came out of that process was not the system she had first built. It was something stronger. She walked the whole perimeter twice more over the following week, pressing her palms against the channel walls, looking at the base of the stone sections, watching how the surface water moved during a light rain. She made 3 small adjustments. She found no other failures. By the middle of October, she was satisfied. The town had mostly stopped watching by then. The widow's moat was old news. People had other things to talk about. Callum Price had moved on to opinions about the new grain elevator. Winter was coming, and there was firewood to lay in, and windows to chink, and the 100 other preparations that pulled attention toward the practical. Nobody was watching Nora Vance anymore. That was fine with her. The fall of 1887 passed as falls in hill country Montana tend to pass, with a long dry October that made everyone briefly hopeful, and then a November that came in cold and grey and definitive, the way November always arrived in that part of the world, like a door being closed from the outside. By November, the Sawback was carrying more water than usual. The October had been dry locally, but there had been heavy rains in the mountains to the north, and the river was running dark and fast at a level that was not alarming, but was worth watching. Nora watched it. By December, the snowpack on the higher elevations was already what old-timers called deep. Not record depth, not yet, but deep enough to notice and deep enough to remember. The kind of snowpack that, when spring came and the temperature rose fast, had a lot to say. She did her winter preparations as she always did. She laid in wood. She cured the meat. She checked the cabin's foundation and found 2 places where the chinking had dried and crumbled, and she replaced it. She made sure the root cellar door closed tight and fit well in its frame, and she thought about the spring. Burr seemed to spend more time than usual that winter lying near the south wall of the cabin, which faced the river. He would press himself against the base of the cabin wall in the evenings and stay there, chin on the floor, looking out through the gap under the door, as if watching something. Dogs do not explain themselves, but a dog that pays close attention to the world does not change its habits without reason, and Nora had learned over the years to pay attention to what Burr paid attention to. The winter of 1887 into 1888 was not the worst winter Millhaven had ever seen, but it was the most deceptive. The temperatures were moderate through January and February. Cold, but not the killing cold that sometimes came to eastern Montana. Not the kind of cold that froze the river solid to depth and locked everything down for 3 months. Instead, it was a wet cold. A steady, accumulating cold that laid snow on the mountains week after week and let none of it melt. The snowpack in the Bitterroot foothills above the Sawback watershed climbed to 4 feet by the 1st of March, then to 5 feet, then to nearly 6 by mid-March. Not falling fast, just falling steadily, patiently, the way something can accumulate without drama until it is suddenly enormous. The old-timers watched it. The farmers watched it. A man named Dolph Calder, who had been running cattle in the hill country for 30 years, and who had a particular gift for reading what the land was saying, told anyone who would listen that the spring thaw was going to be something to reckon with. Most people listened politely and went back to their business. Then March turned, and the temperatures began to climb. Not slowly. Fast. By the 22nd of March, Millhaven had daytime highs in the mid-50s. By the 28th, they were in the low 60s. The mountain snowpack, 6 feet deep in places, began to move. Not in a day, over a week. And then, another week, the meltwater working its way down through the soil and the rock and into the creeks, and the creeks into the Sawback. And the Sawback rising. It rose a foot a day through the first week of April. Then, faster. The morning of April 9th, it was running at 14 feet above summer level. By the evening of April 9th, it was at 17 feet and still climbing, and the low end of Millhaven, Pulpit Road, the old Simmons property, the south end of the business district, the Deering lot and everything around it, was looking at the river with a particular attention that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with fear. On the morning of April 10th, the Sawback crested at 23 feet above summer level and turned sideways into its flood plain. The water moved quietly. That was what people remembered later, how quiet it was. Not the roaring flood of a broken dam or a wall of water rolling down a canyon, just a steady, patient advance of dark water across flat ground, spreading in every direction, finding the low spots first, filling them, then finding the next lowest, filling those. Spreading, rising, finding, water does not fight, water only finds. Burr knew before dawn. He had been sleeping near the south wall the previous week, pressed against the base of it, and on the night of the 9th he did not sleep at all. He stood at the cabin door and made a sound he rarely made. Not a bark, not a whine, but a low sustained note that was neither. Nora got up at 3 in the morning and looked out the window and saw nothing in the darkness, but felt something in the quality of the air outside the glass. A heaviness. A stillness that was not the stillness of cold but of pressure, the held breath before something releases. She dressed. She lit the lantern. She went outside. The night was windless. Absolutely windless. In a country where the wind was almost always present in some form, this stillness was not peaceful. It was the stillness of something paused, of the world holding itself in suspension before a change too large for it to announce in advance. The stars were sharp and hard. The air smelled of wet clay and something else beneath it, something dark and cold and mineral, the smell of river water approaching land it had not covered in years. Burr stood at the gate of the property, pointing south with his whole body, ears forward, completely still. She stood there in the dark and listened, and far away, in the direction of the river, she could hear it, not roaring, not crashing, but a low continuous sound like the whole earth drawing breath, a sound that was not one thing but the sum of 1,000 small movements of water across ground. She went back inside and waited for light. The flood came with the morning. By 7 o'clock the water was visible from the cabin window, a grey-brown sheet spreading across the low ground south of the property, moving north with the slow inevitability of something that had decided. By 8 o'clock it had reached the road south of the Deering lot. By 9 o'clock it was at the edge of the surrounding properties. And then it met the ditch. The water found the channel the way water finds any channel, immediately, completely, without hesitation. It rolled over the southern lip of the surrounding grade and dropped into the trench with a sound like a long exhalation. And it began to move. It moved east along the south channel, it moved west along the south channel, it filled the corners and ran north along both sides and met itself at the northeast overflow gap. And there it crested the deliberate low point at 26 inches above the channel floor and poured through, routing itself down the road swale and away from the property. The ditch was designed to fill, designed to receive the water, to give it a channel and a route, to carry it past the cabin and away. And it did. The water level in the channel rose to 3 feet, 4 feet, 2 inches from the top of the berm, and held. The berm held. The stone-lined walls held. The northeast corner overflow held. The water moved through the system, and away. Inside the berm, on the high ground Nora had created with 61 days of excavated earth, the cabin sat dry. Outside that ring of engineered ground, the town of Millhaven was filling with water. Nora spent the morning of April 10th moving through the cabin, checking the base of every wall, pressing her palm to the stone foundation at ground level, looking for seepage. She found none. She went to the root cellar and felt the top step with her foot, dry. She looked at the earth floor below, dry. The smell of the cellar was cellar smell, wood and earth and stored things. Not river smell. Not the smell of water where water should not be. Outside, the water was still rising. By 10 o'clock she could see it from the east window, standing in the street a block away. Dark and flat and still, carrying debris on its surface. Planks of wood, a bushel basket, the lid of something. It was shin-deep in the street. In the lower-lying areas further south, the reports that would come later told of water waste deep and worse. Furniture floating, the floor of the mercantile covered, the Simmons root cellar, the best stocked in town. 3 years of careful provision. Flooded to the rafters. Burr had stopped his vigil at the gate and come inside, and he was lying in the middle of the cabin floor, watching her move from window to window with an expression of calm assessment. The cold had not killed the Vance cabin. The flood had not killed the Vance cabin. In each case, the thing that was supposed to be unavoidable, the thing that all her neighbors faced as a fact of life in this country, had been met by something her father had known, and his father had known, and that she had carried across 1,000 miles of ground in her hands and her eyes and her understanding of where the water was going to find. She put the kettle on. She made tea. She sat at the table and looked at her hands and thought about Thomas, and about her father, and about the 61 days of digging, and the one corner she had fixed, because Henry Marsh had drawn a diagram in the dirt. She thought about all the small things that had added up to this, to a dry floor and a full root cellar, and a dog asleep in the middle of the room, in the middle of the flood. By noon, the water outside had crested and was no longer rising. By early afternoon, it was beginning, very slowly, to fall. The numbers, when they were assembled, were not subtle. The flood of April 1888, it would be called the Sawback flood, and would go into the county record as such, put between 18 inches and 3 feet of standing water through the lower third of Millhaven. 12 structures on Pulpit Road and the south end of the business district took water inside the structures themselves. 7 root cellars were destroyed, not damaged, destroyed, their contents a total loss. The Simmons family lost $600 in stored goods. The Caldwell family lost their smokehouse and half their winter meat. 4 households lost their cook stoves to rust and silt damage in the months that followed. The Deering property, at the corner of the lowest lying ground in town, in the path of the flood by any geographic measure, the Deering property took no water. Not a trace. Henry Marsh came by 2 days after the flood, when the water had fallen back enough for him to walk the street. He came to the gate and looked at the channel, which was still carrying a slow trickle of drainage water along its stone-lined base. He looked at the berm, still solid, still standing at its full 18 inches. He walked the south side of the perimeter, crouching at intervals to look at the base of the channel walls. He pressed his hand flat against the packed clay of the berm and held it there. He came to the gate where Nora was standing. He took off his hat. He looked at the channel a moment longer. Then he looked at her. He said, "I was wrong. Not about the danger of the system. The danger had been real. What he had been wrong about was what she would do with the warning he'd given her. He had told her the northeast corner was the weakness, and she had fixed it, more carefully. He could see now than anything else on the property. 3 words. That was all he said. 3 words and his hat in his hand, and then he put the hat back on and looked at the channel again for a moment and walked away. The ledger was plain. 18 structures flooded. 1 dry, all the numbers on one side, and all the geometry on the other side. A ditch and a berm and a stone-lined channel and a deliberate low point in the northeast corner, and nothing left to argue about. The knock on the door came that same evening. It was nearly dark, and the water outside was still a foot deep in places, and she heard the footsteps on the porch and then the knock, and she opened the door. Callum Price was standing there. He had his wife beside him, and his wife's mother behind her, and a bundle of what appeared to be household goods wrapped in a canvas tarp. He had mud up to his knees. He was not a small man, but he looked small in the doorway. He did not say much. He asked if they could stay a few days while the water went down. His floor was under 6 inches, and his cellar was gone, and his wife's mother was 72 years old, and couldn't manage in that. Nora said of course. She did not say anything else. She opened the door wider and stood aside and let them pass, and she put more water on for tea, and she showed the older woman where the chair with the footrest was, and she found blankets. Burr regarded the newcomers from his spot on the floor, with the calm, assessing look of a dog who has decided to allow something. Callum sat down at the table, and after a while, when the tea was poured and the older woman was settled, he looked at her and said something. He said he'd called it the widow's moat, and he knew that had been unkind, and he was sorry for it. Nora poured his tea. She said the name had not hurt her. She said she had thought of a different name for it herself, one her father had given to this kind of work, but that it didn't much matter what you called it. He asked what her father had called it. She told him. A French word. Waterwork, her father's version of it, his Cajun Louisiana drainage engineer's version. adapted to whatever piece of ground he was working. The principle was always the same. Understand where the water wants to go before it arrives, give it a better path than the one it will find on its own, and get out of its way. Callum Price sat with that for a while. Then, he said he thought that was probably the smartest thing he'd heard in some time. Neither of them said anything more about it that evening. They stayed 4 days. By the end of the 4 days, 3 other families had come by to ask about the ditch. One family, the Hawthorns, from 2 lots over, had lost their root cellar to the flood and were beginning to understand, in the slow, deliberate way that real understanding tends to arrive, what the difference had been between their property and Nora Vance's. She answered their questions. She walked the perimeter of her property with them and showed them the channel and the berm and the overflow gap at the northeast corner. She showed them the stone lining and explained why the gravel bed had to be at least 4 inches deep and why the channel walls had to be packed in layers rather than all at once. She showed them the section she had rebuilt after the September collapse and explained what had failed and why the repair was stronger than the original. She told them what her father used to say. Water does not fight. Water only finds. She said it the way he had always said it, quietly, the way you say something you have tested against reality a sufficient number of times that it no longer requires emphasis. She told them that if you wanted to protect a piece of ground from water, you had to think the way water thinks, which is to say you had to think without preferences, or ego, or the desire to be right. You had to look at the ground honestly and ask where the water was going to find, and then you had to be more deliberate about that than the water was. She helped the Hawthorns plan their channel over the following 2 weeks. She helped them dig the first 50 feet of it before her back made her slow down. She showed them the northeast corner problem and how to think through the overflow. By the summer of 1888, the Hawthorns had a completed drainage system around their property. By the summer of 1889, 4 more families in Millhaven had built what they were beginning to call the Vance Ditch. Not the Widow's Moat, the Vance Ditch. The name changed because names always eventually tell the truth about the thing they're attached to, even when they start as insults. The Widow's Moat had sounded like foolishness. The Vance Ditch sounded like something you might want on your own property. People began to think of it as a known method, a particular approach with a particular structure, refined to the specific soil and flood behavior of the Sawback River Valley, proven by the flood of 1888, taught neighbor to neighbor and refined with each successive telling. By 1891, 12 properties in the lower third of Millhaven had some version of it. By 1894, it was being discussed at the county level as a standard practice for any new construction in the floodplain. Nobody built a widow's moat anymore. They built a Vance Ditch. Henry Marsh, in his later years, was known to mention Nora Vance when the subject of flood management came up. He would tell the story with the particular candor of a man who had been wrong about something, and had spent time understanding exactly how and why he'd been wrong, and had decided that was a more useful piece of knowledge than being right would have been. He would say that she had done something rare. Not just the digging, the thinking behind the digging, the willingness to look at the ground honestly, without the need to believe the problem was smaller than it was, the willingness to be told about the northeast corner and take it seriously and fix it correctly, rather than defending the work she'd already done. He would say he'd known plenty of men who would have argued with him at that gate, told him the channel was fine, the corner was fine. They'd thought of that already. Men who would have needed to be right more than they needed the ditch to work. He never knew a woman who had dug a better dig.